Oh man, KD looks nice, doesn't he? I mean, coming back from an Achilles injury, we can't make any determinations on what a full season is going to look like based off of a couple of preseason games, but also, with a player like Kevin Durant, with a player as good as Kevin Durant, really all we were looking for in these couple of games is that he physically looked the same, that he could still somewhat do the same things, and I think on that level he has exceeded expectations. Therefore, whether I am setting myself up for failure or not, I am extremely excited to watch Kevin Durant play basketball this season. And it honestly feels good to say that, because given his whereabouts over the last few seasons, it hasn't always been easy to say that. Regardless, he will be the first player that I do this type of video for, because for a lot of our beloved stars, I've kind of wanted to go back and recap their careers very briefly, not going through every single detail, but just going through the stories of their careers a bit, showing where they've been, how they got to this point, and where they might be going. Kevin Wayne Durant. Every now and then we have players that we know are going to be special coming out of college. You don't need to see them in summer league, you don't need to see their preseason games, you've seen them hoop and you just know what's going to translate. KD was that type of player, and he was obviously going to be transformational, as coming to the NBA there weren't that many comparisons for a damn near 7-foot shooting guard. So whoever drafted this kid was practically playing with house money. The Portland Trail Blazers could have very well been playing with house money. They worked him out, they said it was one of the best workouts, if not the best workout they'd ever seen from a prospect, but they decided to play it safe, or at least they thought they were playing it safe by taking a big man to pair with the star guard that they already had. It probably wasn't horrible thinking at the time, but yeah, it was a bag fumble. So KD dropped a second. He was going to be a Seattle Supersonic. This was a franchise that had just gotten rid of their former cornerstone Ray Allen, and they were headed into full rebuild mode, as are most teams that are in the lottery. And so KD was just hooping in his first year. Garbage team, not many other prospects outside of himself, gave him the ball and said go play, and play he did. He won Rookie of the Year. Clearly he was a special talent, but his game just needed a lot of fine-tuning, and luckily for them, Durant was a basketball head. If there was potential to be unlocked in his game, there was not a chance he wasn't going to find out how to get to it. That was pretty much proven in his second year. By then, the franchise had made the move to Oklahoma City. That's an entire story on its own, but the bigger story here is that they'd also drafted what would be his co-star for years to come in Russell Westbrook. But the team was still young in a very tough conference, so they weren't making much noise yet. However, KD had upped his scoring and efficiency. The man was a 25-point per game scorer on 47% in his second year in the league. So just like that, 2 years in, he was already clearly going to be the face of a franchise, he had a co-star, and he was getting better. By that point, most people could tell that this was just a matter of when and not if. Fortunately, this team was very good at drafting for like 3 years straight, so the win was basically now. OKC would go on to draft James Harden, so by the start of KD's third year, he was already on a team that had gotten him some pieces to play with. It certainly does not unfold this way for every amazing draft prospect, and it was becoming clear KD would have a chance to do something amazing with this Thunder franchise. And again, the win was now. Durant, in his third season in the NBA, would up his scoring average to 30 points a game, become the scoring champion, and place second in MVP voting behind only LeBron James. This incredible season would help propel the Thunder to 50 wins, that's up from 23 the previous season, and while this was only good enough for 8th in that year's Western Conference, for reference, that would have had them around 4th or 5th in the East, and it was an identical record to the Celtics, who went to the finals and came within one win of winning it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, this set Durant up with the first major test of his career, playing the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers in the first round. Not only would he have to lead a young team to dealing with Kobe Bryant, Durant himself would have to find ways to be effective against Ron Artest, whose sole goal was to shut him down. When it was all said and done, this Thunder team came within a single shot of forcing a Game 7 with the eventual NBA champions of that season. So while the Thunder would just barely fall short, it was very clear that the team was there to stay, and to make gigantic jumps every single year. Come the 2011 season, Durant would again win the scoring title, and the Thunder, in a move to help secure Durant a contending team to match his progression, would go on to trade for Kendrick Perkins. It sounds like a joke now, but that was actually an important addition for what this team was trying to do. They didn't have a very solid center before that, and at least on the defensive end now they did. OKC would go on to win 55 games, move up to 4th in the Western Conference, and they were now a legitimate contender. There was no more element of surprise. And as the playoffs progressed, they'd gone from an 8 seed first round out all the way to the Western Conference Finals within one season. It appeared that their time had already arrived, but they ran into Dirk Nowitzki on a Mavericks team that was just on an absolute mission. The Thunder would once again fall short, but at that point, tracking from them jumping from 23 to 50 wins in one season, then jumping from an 8 seed to a 4 seed in the Western Conference Finals, the next natural progression was the NBA Finals. And everybody who thought that way happened to be 100% correct. 2012 was a lockout-shortened year, but the Thunder, being as young and spry as they were perfectly equipped to handle this. Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook were both certified superstars by this point, and James Harden would go on to win 6th Man of the Year. Durant, for the 3rd season in a row, is a scoring champion. He's moved back to 2nd place in MVP voting team behind only LeBron James, and he's helped lead the Thunder to supplant basically every superior team in the West. The Mavericks have fallen off, the Lakers were declining, and so for the regular season they'd only place behind the San Antonio Spurs. And the funny part about this was, those were the exact 3 teams that the Thunder went through to make the NBA Finals. First was the Mavericks, who clearly were not the same team and got dusted. Then there was the Lakers, who clearly needed to retool. By the way, they swept Dallas and gentlemen swept the Lakers. So all that was left was San Antonio, and they looked much better for 2 games. And then it was just clear that they weren't. Those 2 games were all San Antonio got, and so in just their 4th season after moving to Oklahoma as a lottery team, they were in the NBA Finals with a potential trio. Kevin Durant was 23 years old. This league had never seen a player with his style, and the only player beating him for most valuable some seasons was LeBron James, who of course he would have to get past to secure his first championship in this next final series. But that was just terrible timing. LeBron was fresh off of a 2011 disappointment. He had no choice but to win this season. Miami had their own trio, so while some had the Thunder as the favorite to win, the Miami Heat would have dissolved the franchise quicker than they would have lost that series. But OKC was extremely competitive. It does not look like it this many years later. It was 5 games, but 4 of those were close. James Harden had a horrible series, and while they were on the big stage, it might have been the first time that the masses noticed that Russell Westbrook might need to be a different type of point guard to win with Kevin Durant. Those were conversations for later though. For now, only the guarantee that these 3 were absolutely going to many more NBA Finals. That might have happened, except we'd never find out. James Harden would get traded a couple of months later, and with this version of history that we're left with, it's probably fair to say that was the exact moment that Kevin Durant's time with the Thunder went south. But at the time, since he and Westbrook looked like a superstar duo, perhaps it was a good thing to not have a third ball handler progress next to them. And they won 60 games, best in the West, clearly on a collision course with the Miami Heat for a rematch. Yet LeBron would be chosen for MVP over Kevin Durant once again, and Westbrook would be hurt at the very beginning of that year's playoffs. The Western Conference gave exactly 0 margin for error as things stood, and having to go against the stifling defense of a tough Grizzlies team without his co-star, Durant just wouldn't be enough. The Thunder were out in the second round, and that meant that it took 6 seasons for the Thunder, led by Kevin Durant, to not make progress in a single year. Every year before that, they took some jump in wins, they got further in the playoffs, he got better, and so while he was definitely a better player, this is where the misfortune started. And maybe it wouldn't have been as much of an issue if James Harden was there. Had Harden have been there, in Westbrook's absence, assuming a freak accident still takes place, the Thunder would have probably found out then and there that James Harden and Kevin Durant would make the better duo. Water under the bridge though, just 1 season. With Westbrook healthy and Kevin Durant growing, they'd get another shot at it. Except Westbrook in 2014 would not be healthy. He'd be in and out with knee complications from that incident. This forced Kevin Durant, in a brutal Western Conference, to play out of his entire mind. The Thunder still won 59 games, which was good enough for 2nd in the West, and Kevin Durant averaged 32 points on 50% shooting. That doesn't even do that season justice though. These were some of the most difficult shots and angles that a player had to take throughout a season. The Thunder were good, but there was nothing close to a second star to alleviate the pressure. In theory, his efficiency should have gone down, he should have burnt out, but he got better, and he won MVP, totally deservingly. For once, somebody other than LeBron won it, and I don't think anybody really argued the result. And this time, Westbrook would be able to participate in the playoffs. Up to that point, in the last 2 playoffs that the duo had participated in, they'd either been to the conference finals or the NBA finals. This year, they'd make it to the conference finals, again having to conquer the Spurs test, and in typical Oklahoma City Thunder luck, lightning wouldn't strike, but misfortune would. Serge Ibaka was apparently going to miss the rest of the playoffs with a calf injury. There was no way in hell they were going any farther without him. They lost the first 2 games to the Spurs without him. Then he magically reappeared, and the Thunder tied the series. Thunder fans will forever have to wonder, if Ibaka hadn't got hurt, would they have gone down 0-2 in the first place? But that is just the nature of the business. And the Spurs really could not live with themselves if they didn't make it back to the finals to avenge that loss against Miami. Thus, the Thunder were out in 6. At this point, Kevin Durant is getting dangerously close to having to make some contract decisions. However, he and Westbrook are always on the brink of success every season. So, being one of the most beloved players in the NBA and being probably the most beloved person in OKC, it's not really clear why he would go anywhere or where he would go yet. Plus, dating back to 2012, their biggest threat is the San Antonio Spurs, who are probably aging out sooner than later. A team they'd already beaten once and could probably beat again. That's when Kevin Durant would sustain a fracture in his foot before the 2015 season, and it would interfere with all of their plans. He would be in and out, eventually missing the entire season, causing the Thunder to miss the playoffs. Around that same time, another young team steals their thunder. Yeah, the Golden State Warriors come out of absolutely nowhere, and they do what the Thunder had been trying to do for the last 4 or 5 seasons in 1 year. Of course, it isn't quite that simple, but regardless of the details, the Warriors supplanted the Thunder as that up-and-coming team in the Western Conference. They did it unexpectedly, and they did it with total team basketball. There were no questions about the point guard and selfishness and decision-making. There was just basketball supremacy with no misfortunes. So now it's 2016, and Kevin Durant has returned healthy, but to to a tougher conference. It's no longer just the Spurs aging out, it's this young Warriors team that is going to be here for a very long time. As Golden State begins to stare down a historic season, there are rumblings that in free agency they might pursue Kevin Durant. It doesn't sound realistic, but it's also not impossible. It would take quite the perfect storm, like the one that was brewing that year. And I personally believe there's one sequence from their match around February or March that perfectly sums up where everything was going. Russell Westbrook left with a contested leaning shot off the backboard to try and win the game, and Steph Curry successfully winning the game from the logo. Considering everything that happened shortly after this, it kind of speaks for itself. We'll never know exactly when Kevin Durant first thought of joining the Warriors, but it's hard not to believe he was getting curious around this point. In 2016, there were one of three teams coming out of the Western Conference. There was the 73-9 Warriors squad, the Spurs team that had picked up LaMarcus Aldridge and only gotten better, or the Thunder. Kevin Durant helped lead this Thunder squad to upset the Spurs. That was a huge moment because going out in the second round on a free agency year after everything had happened probably would have assured he was leaving. And an even bigger moment was the Thunder apparently taking back the throne from this Warriors team that had stole their attention. OKC simply looked better. They looked more athletic, they looked faster on defense, they looked more explosive. They seemed to match this Warriors team perfectly. So the only thing they had left to do was to ruin the perfect season and meet LeBron James in the NBA Finals once again. That rematch, finally. There's no guarantee that just making the finals would have convinced KD to stay, but winning it probably would have done the trick. Again, and a point that I probably have not harped on nearly enough, Kevin Durant's image was squeaky clean. He was one of the most beloved players in the league. No scandals, nothing off court, just a straight hooper. A generational talent that got better every year, and when healthy, always had this team in contention. They were built through the draft, there weren't a bunch of stars being recruited and teaming up with him. Winning in 2016 would have propelled his career into the stratosphere, in the purest of ways possible. So it was rather detrimental that not only did they go on to blow this 3-1 lead, but that was heavily behind the fact that Kevin Durant did not have great performances down the stretch. So whether he and Westbrook were a great duo together was kind of irrelevant when, as the second best player in the league at that point, third at worst, he just couldn't get the job done. And completing the perfect storm was Golden State going on to lose to Cleveland. That made it, in Durant's mind, acceptable to go to that team. If he'd lost to them and they were the champions, that was just something even he couldn't do. But he'd lost to that team and they'd lost, so maybe it looked like they needed each other? Look, however he rationalized it in his head, that's not how it was received by the public. Durant had options. Could have gone to the Spurs, who they'd beaten, the Celtics, the Clippers. By this point, people understood if he felt like he couldn't play with Westbrook, or if he felt like he couldn't win with Westbrook. If he felt like there was a better play style out there, no one was gonna blame him. But everything in life is optics, and going to Golden State was the worst of them. He did it, he claimed it was actually the biggest challenge to go to Golden State, it was the hardest thing to do, and his image took off full speed in the opposite direction. So, the Kevin Durant Golden State Warrior days were a lot of beautiful basketball, and a lot of anger. Chief among the reasons was that they'd basically ruined competition in the NBA. They officially had three of the greatest shooters of all time. They played the modern style of basketball perfectly, and without injuries, the reality was they just weren't going to lose. Kevin Durant would go on to capture his first NBA championship in 2017, but at what cost? That Warriors team lost one game the entire playoffs, and it was in the finals. They could have very easily swept the entire bracket. There was little to no adversity, little to no suspense, actually just no suspense, and the response to his 2017 title was the exact opposite of what it would have been if he had won in 2016. And given how much he's acknowledged fan chatter over social media, he knew full and well what the perception of that title was and any title that he won with the Warriors would be. And make no mistake, there could have been as many as health would allow. Funny thing is, as often happens with super teams, by the second year the wheels were already somewhat loosening. Durant was known to go a bit more ISO and play outside of Steve Kerr's system. Once Iguodala went out against the Rockets in the Western Conference Finals, they got dangerously close to losing and might have even lost if Chris Paul wouldn't have went down. Nonetheless, they'd go on to win another title against a significantly weaker Cavs team, and during that championship parade, Bob Myers would go on to joke that Kevin Durant hadn't earned the same type of contract that Steph Curry had. It was a joke, but it was lock in step with the perception of Kevin Durant as a whole around that time. That summer, the Warriors seemed to get even more ridiculous by signing an injured DeMarcus Cousins. It didn't matter that he was injured though, it mattered who he was playing with, and the fact that he would probably have more freedom to be himself. That was the thought. A couple of guys on the Blazers didn't like that. Kevin Durant did a podcast that summer with CJ McCollum. He basically called the Blazers food to his face, and that clearly made CJ feel some type of way, although he laughed it off at that moment because he later got on Twitter, quote tweeted a tweet that was about Kevin Durant and basically said what everybody had been saying. We just really hadn't heard it verbalized from other players. So there were probably way more players, maybe even the entire league, that felt like CJ did, that the move was soft, that joining the other team was basically like getting jumped and then joining the jumpers. And yeah, he basically put Kevin Durant on blast. Nobody would really say it before that. Other players would hint at it, but nobody had actually said it before CJ. Not in the players' ranks anyways. This was always coming from fans, people he could just shut out or pretend tend to shut out, but hearing that you're not even really respected amongst your peers, that's kind of difficult. And it's even more difficult when it comes from a teammate. Yeah, months later, it comes from Draymond Green during a Clippers game. They have a spat about what happens at the end of it, and Draymond goes on a tirade against KD, who he's mad at because Durant hasn't made any formal commitments to the Warriors. Free agency is looming. It's hanging over their head. He's been signing small deals to keep his options open. This clearly bothered Green. He let it all out. He said how he really felt, and so all within probably about 4 or 5 months, Kevin Durant learned that some of his peers didn't respect him for what he'd done, and that some of his teammates who'd he'd taken all this flack to join kind of felt like he was expendable. Like they'd built this without him and he just was along for the ride. So at that point, you can probably say the Kevin Durant and Golden State era was done. Of course, winning heals all wounds. They could have gone on to win another championship, but there was also the fact of the matter that despite winning the ones that he'd already gotten, nobody saw Kevin Durant as the best player in the NBA. Nobody had given him that title over LeBron James. He thought going to the Warriors and winning was going to give him that title. It did not. KD had been coming second to LeBron his entire career. During the NBA Finals, second best player in the league, second in MVP voting. He said this himself before winning MVP, and after winning titles, he was in most people's minds still behind LeBron. So he could continue winning titles in Golden State, but it was extremely unclear when he was ever going to get the respect he felt he deserved. Later on that season, during All-Star Weekend, he was seen chatting in the tunnel with Kyrie Irving. It was already rumored that there may have been a team up between him and Kyrie in one of the boroughs. Of course, they both said that they had no clue where any of this was coming from and that they were just focused on basketball that season, but that's never true. And his road out of Golden State was pretty much solidified by that year's playoffs. He suffered an injury against the Rockets, which looked very scary. It looked at minimum like he wouldn't be playing in that year's playoffs again, but he decided to be unselfish. He decided to come back when they were down 3-1 against the Toronto Raptors. Perhaps the fact that the Warriors had fallen down without him and could very possibly pull off a 3-1 comeback of their own with him. In his mind, it was maybe an opportunity to get some of the respect he didn't understand why he didn't have. But he could have been just as fine taking care of himself, probably allowing the Warriors to lose, which, let's be honest, would have been better for his image. And then he could have left. He could have went and did his own thing. But when he did come back to play, this time the injury that we believed he had against Houston actually happened. So one way or another, the Golden State dynasty at this point was hanging on by threads. Sure, KD could re-sign with them, come back in a year, restart the dynasty, possibly even repair his image through that adversity. But through everything that had happened and been said over the last 3 years, the option of a new beginning was clearly too good to pass up. KD and Kyrie joined Brooklyn with the full understanding that whatever they would be would not take place for a year. And that year has passed. Here we are, in the last phase of Kevin Durant's career. Achilles injuries are absolutely devastating. We have very few examples of superstar or MVP players having this injury, returning to their previous level. As a matter of fact, if KD was even close to his former self throughout this year, going on to win an NBA championship, it's not crazy to think that he would probably have the respect he feels is long overdue. And while you still see people talk about his past decision from time to time, there's no doubt seeing him go down the way he did, having an all-time great snatched from the league so abruptly, the hate probably is not as strong as it once was. And overcoming the adversity of this tragic part of his career, with an opportunity to likely cap it off with a title against LeBron James, his career can truly come full circle. But that all remains to be written. For right now, this is how we came to be at this part of the story of KD. Let me know what other players you would like a video like this for. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, comment, and sub, and also hit the bell next to my name if you want notifications every time a new video drops. I appreciate you all watching, and I'll see you on the next one.